Hey, everybody. Welcome to our class series, Life with God. This is a 6-part series that I'm co-teaching with my buddy Houston Heflin, and we're really glad that you're able to be with us for this part 3 in the series. To begin with, today, I just want to say that all of today is simply about one simple command in the Bible. It's a very simple command. It's brief. It's easy to read. It's not that hard to understand. It's 1 Thessalonians 5:17. You know that passage where Paul says, pray without ceasing. Now, what does that mean? To pray without ceasing, to pray constantly, to pray always. There are 3 possible things it could mean that I want to talk about today. One sort of comes out of Psalm 55:17, where the psalmist says, evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress, and he hears my voice. Evening, morning, and noon, I cry out, and he hears me. That's like 3 times a day, right? This is something that the Jewish people developed as a tradition, as a habit in their life, praying 3 times a day, so that at the beginning of the day you would have a prayer time, in the middle of the day there would be prayer, and then at the end of the day there would be prayer too. Daniel does this, right? In Daniel chapter 6 and verse 10, he's got this habit. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed. This was a common Jewish practice in the ancient world. It was a practice of routinely praying set times during the day. Now, there are lots of ways to do this, but first I want to remind us that we have lots of routines. We have lots of habits. We have meals at set times. We brush our teeth every day or after every meal and before bed. We might have workouts, physical workouts that we're involved in every day. At a certain time of the day, maybe we watch the news. We have coffee breaks. There are lots of things that we do day in and day out that we do by habit, that are routine. And in the wisdom of the Jews, one of the things that you wanted to do as one of your daily habits, daily routines, was to have these prayer rhythms at set times, and maybe especially 3 times a day. So it's like when you get out of bed, you have a time of prayer. And then when you're in the middle of the day, the middle of your work day, then you break out a few minutes to have a time of prayer. Then at the end of the day, before you go to bed, you have a time of prayer. They tried to base this on the hours of the day, the movements of the sun. You might set alarms on your phone or something like this to sort of trigger you to remember that it's time for prayer. It's time to take a minute to have a conversation with God and let not just the habits of toothbrushing and TV watching and exercise workouts be what structures the rhythms of our day, but let conversation with God be a part of what determines the shape of each day. This was something that the early Jews, that the ancient Jews did, and it's also something that early Christians found really helpful. Some early Christians got into the habit of doing this twice a day. They would do it early and then late, or at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. Some Christians had 5 set times through the day. This was a routine that Jews had. This was a routine that early Christians had, that you would break out specific times of the day for prayer through the day. Some did it 5 times a day. But we know that one of the most common ways of doing it was to have 3 daily times. You see this in Daniel. You see this in the Psalms. We also see it at the end of the 1st century in some early Christian sources, like a document known as the Didache. And there, the writer encourages Christians to have 3 prayer times every day, and to develop that habit of praying, especially the Lord's Prayer. A lot of early Christians used the Lord's Prayer from Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, as a prayer to begin their prayer time, or perhaps a prayer to end their devotional time. because it was a prayer that you could commit to memory, and because the prayer, in very brief ways, covers so many of the things that are important to Christian relationships and transformation and mission. And also, it's the prayer that Jesus gave his disciples and instructed them to pray. So what better way to start and or end a particular prayer time? But you don't have to do that. The idea is to let set times of brief prayer punctuate the major periods of your day. And I think for many of us, this isn't a new idea. It's a simple practice. It's not hard, but it's the kind of practice that bathes your day in conversation with God. It's the kind of practice that reminds you at key points through the day that you're walking with God and that God's walking with you. Now, someone might say, yeah, but aren't you afraid if you've got these sort of set times of prayer, or if you pray every time your phone sets off an alarm or something, aren't you afraid that it'll just get sort of humdrum and routine, that you'll just be praying to God by rote? Well, I understand that concern because we want to pursue God with all our hearts, and we want our lives with God to be sincere. But sometimes we're just using that as an excuse to get out of good habits. First of all, there are worse things to do by rote than pray to God. And probably you and I are already doing some of those things. Wouldn't it be nice to develop good habits of speaking to God instead? We already do lots of things by habit and by rote and by routine. We've got many things up here that tumble out very quickly when triggered. Wouldn't it be nice if one of the things that tumbled out very quickly when triggered is the Lord's Prayer or words of prayer to God? Second, I don't think we're always aware of how much we let our spiritual lives become just another set of things that we're consuming because we're conditioned to be consumers in our culture. I don't think we're always aware the degree to which our hunger to do something new, to do something fresh, to have a new idea, to have a new experience, to sing a new song, that those impulses are feeding some pretty unhealthy addictions. Addictions to having to have new experiences of a certain kind in order to keep our attention. The irony is that deep, abiding spiritual life comes not so much through new things and fancy things, but through deeper things like constancy, faithfulness, and attentiveness. And this is one of the key insights of what it means to live a spiritual life with God. The habits that you have, the things that you do every day, the things that you do week in and week out, those are by far the most spiritually formative things in your life. By far the most spiritually formative. I know there can be these wonderful mountaintop experiences and these one-off things that happen once and never again, and they can be spectacular and they can really form us. But by far, the most deeply spiritually formative things in our lives are determined by the habits that we have every day, every week, every month, every year. Many of them are repetitive. Many of them are sort of plain vanilla, or they feel that way. But I'm telling you, they are the most deeply spiritually formative things. That's true for us as adults. It's true for our children. It's true for youth. It's true for all of us. So I don't think we understand the extent to which our interest in having something new and fresh is actually feeding a pathology and an addiction to something unhealthy, when many of the best spiritual practices are practices of habit and rhythm. Third, what if prayer were more about relationship than about some fresh experience that I want to consume? What if prayer were more about relationship, maybe even than about getting things from God? Think about Jesus and the intimate relationship that Jesus has with his Father. Now, there were a lot of things that form that relationship that Jesus has with his Father. But one of the things that we easily overlook is Jesus' prayer habits. because Jesus has these amazing prayer habits, and often they're just mentioned briefly in a sentence or part of a sentence. But you'll read something like Luke 5:16. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. He often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. That was one of his regular things. He went to synagogue to pray. He went to the temple to worship, to pray. He prayed in different ways in different times, but he often withdrew to pray. There are aspects of that we're going to talk more about in another lesson, because sometimes Jesus prayed all night when he does this, right? Now, what kind of prayer is this that Jesus is praying? Unfortunately, for me, too often, I think of prayer as being my chance to tell God what I want. I want him to give me this. I want him to fix that. I want him to provide this. I want him to protect me from that. Well, if Jesus' all-night prayers were just requests like that, that must have been a pretty long list of requests. Or are these prayers more about being with the Father, more about cultivating relationship than about asking God for things? I think a good example of this would be relationships with people that we love, like my wife, Linda. If my communication with my wife, Linda, is mostly a sort of shopping list, like when I talk to Linda, I say, honey, I'm glad to see you today because here are the things I need from you. Here's what I want you to do. Please do this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. What kind of relationship is that going to be? What kind of relationship will that shape? What understanding of my wife am I forming within myself? Am I going to be measuring the quality of our marriage based on whether she gets me all the things I'm asking for? But sometimes I fear that we measure the success of our prayers that way. And we even sometimes feel a crisis of faith if God's not giving us things that we ask for. I think God wants more from us in our prayer time, more than just a laundry list of requests. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with prayers of petition, prayers where we go to God and tell him the desires of our hearts and ask him to help us in different ways. There's nothing wrong with that. But that needs to be resting on something deeper than a laundry list of requests. It needs to be resting on a desire for relationship, a prayer that's about relationship. And whether or not it's working is about how that relationship's going, not about whether I'm getting the things I asked for. And this is why simple habits like setting repetitive prayer times, even if the prayers you pray are always the Lord's Prayer or some other simple short prayer, having simple prayer times can be so powerful. It's not that any one of those times is necessarily going to be spectacular and earth-shattering, although some of them probably will be. But I'm telling you, when we carve out that kind of time for the one we love, our God, our Father, over weeks, over months, over years, the committed habits of regular prayer engrave deep rhythms of relationship. And it's like many spiritual practices. It doesn't actually require a lot of effort. It doesn't require a lot of technique. It doesn't require that you understand anything tricky. It simply requires constancy, faithfulness, attentiveness. You commit to something and you follow through. And that's why I struggle with it so much. That's why I struggle to find regular times of prayer during the day. It's not because of anything very tricky. It's because I struggle to value God enough, to value God more than my work, to value God more than a few more bucks that I would get if I were to work a few more hours or do this or that, to value God more than whatever I might gain in recreational activities or whatever, to make sure that I've got this time carved out. It's something that I think the evil one wants to keep us from doing. So there are always going to be a lot of impediments that make it harder for us to do this rather than easier. But I think God will help us if we want to commit to this simple practice of having set times of prayer during the day. Now, that's the first one. There's another way to pray without ceasing too. And here I want to draw your attention to Psalm 16. In Psalm 16 and verse 1, the psalmist says, "Keep me safe, O God. Keep me safe, O God." These days, I think we can relate to the psalmist's desire to find safety in God. He goes on to say, "In you I take refuge." I think we understand the desire to find refuge because the world around us is chaotic, because many things aren't going the way we wish they would go, because there are risks and dangers and problems everywhere we look. And that's certainly true during this season of COVID, when we're concerned about our loved ones, when some of the people we really care about are sick, or people are suffering because of job losses and hits to their business, and all of the changed plans that have happened at school and travel, some things that seem maybe minor and some things that are much more major, but they're all really disruptive, and it makes it hard for us to find rest anywhere. So the psalmist says in Psalm 16 that he wants to take refuge in God. And he goes on to say in verse 8, "I have set the Lord always before me. Because he's at my right hand, I'll not be shaken." I've set the Lord always before me. Now, where is God in my life? To be honest, I think I know that the Lord is always present. He is present, but it doesn't always feel like he's present. I really do believe that he is here, but it's easy for me to lose sight of him. It's easy for me to forget that he's present with me. One type of praying without ceasing is to practice the presence of God. That's what it's sometimes called. It recognizes that God is already present. We just need to train ourselves better to recognize his presence, especially in the normal routine matters and times of the day. Now, this is a common type of prayer or discipline practice, but one person in particular became very famous for it. It's a guy named Brother Lawrence who lived in 17th century France. And this was a guy who worked in the kitchen. And so day in and day out, he was peeling potatoes and cooking food and scrubbing pots and serving meals and running errands. He just had all of this sort of regular humdrum work to do that a lot of us can relate to. It's just the chores and tasks of everyday life. But he practiced a kind of prayer that reminded him God was present in all of those things and that all of that work was being done for God. And he became so good at it that people would come to him and say, "How do you do this?" And he would explain the practice. It really isn't complicated. I'll sort of boil it down for you. Basically, here's what he would do. Before starting a task, he would shoot off a quick prayer to God. A prayer may be something like, "My God, I'm all yours." When he was in the middle of that task, when it occurred to him, "Oh yeah, God's here with me peeling this potato," then he would shoot up another quick prayer. "Lord, make me according to your heart," or something like this. And then when he finished the task and was about to set it down and maybe move to the next thing, then he would shoot off a quick prayer. In a way, the prayers were spontaneous, but they were sort of tied to his tasks and activities. And so that meant he was always sort of praying about the tasks and activities that he was doing. Usually they were silent prayers, especially if other people were around. It might be common for someone to do this silently, but they were constant prayers. When I'm getting ready to do something, I offer this thing to God. I pray to God. I remind my heart and my soul that God is present and that God has given me this job to do, and that God wants me to do it to his honor and to the service of other people. And then when I'm in the middle of it, I want to offer myself to God. And when I'm done with it, I want to give this task, give this errand, give this, clean pot or this freshly cooked potato dish. I want to give this to people while praying to God within my mind, within my heart about this job that I've done. The amazing thing about this simple practice is that it trains us to recognize the presence of God. It can train us to see that God is with us through the day. It helps us understand that, I think, better. It's not that he's not present with us. It's that we've got so much noise, so much activity, so many distractions inside, and certainly plenty of distractions outside, that we simply aren't conditioned to seeing his presence, to feeling his presence, even though we believe it's there. Well, you can practice the presence through this very simple discipline, whatever your tasks are. And the amazing thing is that this simple practice sanctifies everyday activities. It sanctifies the work of washing dishes in the kitchen. It sanctifies mowing the lawn. It sanctifies the work at the office that you're doing. When you're on your floor in the hospital and you're tending to patients and praying this way, it sanctifies that activity. When you're working in the school cafeteria and serving food to the kids, it sanctifies that. These are all places where God is present. And the work being done here is being done for God, for the Lord, like Paul says in Colossians 3:23. This is a way of practicing the remembrance that I'm actually working for the Lord and that the Lord cares about this practice. It also sanctifies me, right? Because when I pray to God before doing something, and I kind of get into the habit of that regular conversation of prayer about my tasks, well, it makes it a little harder probably to do some things. I'm probably not easily going to say, Lord, as I'm about to log on to this website and watch movies I shouldn't be watching, I hope that you'll bless my time. No, probably not. Or Lord, as I go into this committee meeting and I'm about to thoroughly thrash and abuse somebody who's upset me, please accept this offering with all my heart. There's this kind of reciprocal thing that happens when you practice the presence of God. It sanctifies all the normal stuff that we sometimes don't think of as being spiritual, but it also sanctifies us so that we're thinking in terms of how the work that we're doing really is work for God. So I want to commend that practice to you. This is another way of praying without ceasing, practicing the presence of God. And it's really very simple. You just get into the habit of shooting off a quick, probably wordless prayer to God when you're in transition, when you're about to pick something up and when you're putting it down and when you're moving on to the next thing. And as you get into that habit, over time, it becomes clearer and clearer to you that God is present in that. And he's there to sustain. You have set God always before you, as the psalmist says. Not because the psalmist thought he could manipulate God, but the psalmist wanted to recognize that God was at his right hand. That's not just something for your head to acknowledge, a truth to assent to and say, well, God is always at my right hand. You can practice God always being at your right hand and then learn it deep down through practicing the presence of God. This brings me to another simple practice, the third one and the last one I want to talk about today, that I think is also especially appropriate for this difficult time of isolation and uncertainty. And it grows out of 1 Thessalonians 5 again. Verse 17, pray without ceasing. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 encourages us to do something else without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, Paul says, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. That can be hard. That can be hard. When my day is not going the way I wanted my day to go, it can be hard to give thanks. When the world is in chaos and it seems like everybody's gone crazy, it can be hard to give thanks. When COVID is raging through our society and upsetting everything, it can be hard to give thanks. But in 1 Thessalonians 5, Paul doesn't say, when you feel good, give thanks. When you feel grateful, give thanks. When things are going well for you, give thanks. When you're not feeling any anxiety, give thanks. When you feel like everything is well managed, give thanks. When the people around you are doing what you think they should, then give thanks. When you're doing pretty well, at least compared to the people that you like to compare yourself to know whether or not you're doing well, then give thanks. It's unconditional. And it's not because Paul never knew hard times. This isn't easy for Paul to say. Paul knew some difficult times, and he's writing to Christians who know some very difficult times. Give thanks always. It's not about how you feel. It's a practice. It's a practice. And it's a very simple practice of cultivating prayers of gratitude. Now, this is a tough one. And it makes me think about the difference between people who cultivate gratitude and people who don't. And I'm one of those who often doesn't. The difference between being happy and being unhappy really doesn't have as much to do with your circumstances as you think. It's a lot more about how you see things, and how you see things depends a lot on what you're practicing. And they did some studies a few years back at UC Davis and also the University of Miami. There were these 3 groups of students, and each student was tasked with writing diaries at the end of every day to write about their day. But each one of them had different prompts. So one group was told, in your diary, write about all the hassles and problems you had today. And another group was sort of a neutral, had a neutral prompt. Just write whatever you want. Just reflect on your day and write about that. And the third group was given a prompt where they were supposed to focus on the good things, the positive things that happened that day, what we as Christians would call their blessings. Well, guess which group ended up being happier at the end of this exercise? Yeah, obviously, it's the group that in a disciplined way meditated on and reflected on the things that were good about the day and the blessings that they'd received, the things that they should really be grateful for. That group was more optimistic at the end of it. They felt like they were more on top of things in their lives. They felt like things were in better shape and going better than the other groups. This group also spent more time helping others because they were more aware of the fullness out of which they could give. They were more generous with their time than the others. There's something about cultivating ingratitude that makes you stingy, that makes you not want to share, that makes you less likely to take risks, to be vulnerable, to give out of your abundance because you don't feel like you have any abundance. The gratitude group even slept better than the others. Yeah, and they did this same result with adults, not just with students, but with adults who had neuromuscular diseases. It turned out just meditating on gratitude each day helped those grown-ups sleep better. And their partners were also happier in the studies. It turns out people who know how to be satisfied are more pleasant to be around than people who don't. If you're like me, you're pretty good at spotting problems and complaining about things that you don't like. Too often, that's what we practice. It's a practice. It's a practice, and it shapes who we are deep down. Too often, we practice being unhappy with the way things are. We practice reflecting on what's missing. We practice thinking about the deficiencies and the defects. We practice reflecting on what's gone wrong, what's going wrong at work, what's going wrong at church, what's going wrong with our families. But those practices shape us. This is something that spiritual masters like the Apostle Paul have known for a long time. You didn't need University of Miami studies to show this. That's why he says in 1 Thessalonians 5, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Or in Philippians 4:2, I've learned to be content. Not because of circumstances, in spite of circumstances. What's the old song? Count your blessings. Well, this is actually a key spiritual practice, to count your blessings. And there are many different kinds of simple prayers that focus on particular themes. We'll talk about more in a couple of our other lessons, but I want to emphasize here in this lesson the prayer of cultivating gratitude. This is a way of practicing what Paul commands us to do in 1 Thessalonians 5:18. There are different ways to do it. If you have set prayer times, like 3 times a day, make one of those prayers a prayer of gratitude, where all you do in that prayer is look for, think about, talk about the things that you should be thankful for before God, and to give God thanks for those things. You'll find that there are more of those once you start attuning your heart and your eyes to spot them. You'll find that there are probably more of those through the day than you thought. But also, what I've noticed is that when you get into this habit, you begin to learn that even some of the things that I really would rather have griped about can be transformed into opportunities to give thanks because of the good things that come on the backs of those challenges or those difficulties. And I'm not trying to make light of struggles or suffering or pain. And there's certainly times to go to God in lamentation. I'm not negating that at all. But I want to encourage us to engage in this simple cultivation of gratitude. We might keep a journal where we list the things through the day that we can be thankful for and then lift them up before God in gratitude. We can teach our kids to do this as a regular thing where it's not prayer requests. We can do this in small groups. We can do this in our Bible class. It's not prayer request time, which usually pushes us into the gap thinking. Again, there's nothing wrong with petitionary prayer. And in that, we're practicing our reliance upon God, which is a good thing. There's a place for that. But this is an area we probably don't practice well enough to be spiritually healthy. I know I don't. That is cultivating gratitude, listing the things we're thankful for, and then reciting those things before each other, and especially before God. So these are the 3 ways of praying that I want to talk about today that I think are pretty good ways to pray continually, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5, to create set times of prayer through the day and try to stick to those habits, to practice the presence of God through our workaday lives, through that practice of lifting up prayer at every sort of turning point in our tasks, and then cultivating gratitude by making sure that some of our regular prayer life is strictly focused on thankfulness and gratitude, and that we'll carve out some times where we pray only about that, and that we try to multiply those times and lean into those times rather than spend so much of our energy, like I do, nursing all of my grievances and grudges. None of these is complicated. None of them is complicated. They're all very simple. But that's the trick. The trick is that there's not really a trick when it comes to life with God and cultivating these practices. Spiritual growth is not really so much about complicated techniques. It's not as much about fancy things and trying to figure things out that are difficult and complicated. What makes spiritual growth difficult so often is the challenge of simply committing to simple habits over time. We understand this. We understand this, for example, when it comes to dieting. If I say today, I'm going to skip a bowl of ice cream and then I'm going to weigh myself tomorrow, I should be a good 10 or 20 pounds lighter, right? I'm trying to lose 20 pounds. Let's skip one bowl of ice cream. Is that going to work? I don't think so. Or I want to lose 20 pounds, or I want to build up my cardiovascular strength. And so I'm going to do a good walk around the block. And I did that. So I'm good, right? Just doing it once. That should be enough. Diet is not that way. Exercise is not that way. learning skills, it doesn't work that way. Carpentry is not this way. Quilting is not this way. Jiu-jitsu is not this way. And the other skills of Christianity, like forgiving and loving and patience, all of these things that God calls us to, they're much more about the habits we commit to than they are about tricky techniques or amazing insights. And that's both encouraging and discouraging, I think. Encouraging because you don't have to know a lot, and you don't have to have a lot of fancy abilities to do these things. It's discouraging because it's a reminder again that the real problem is simply committing to something and sticking to it. But just like with diet and exercise and learning any skills, it's really about what you commit yourself to over time and then sticking with that over time. Unfortunately, it's often the case that it's when we're in the middle of a storm that we say, I'd really like to have a spiritual life. That would help me right now. And we're very motivated. But we could weather the storm more faithfully if we'd invested more of our habits and commitments in the plain old vanilla daily, weekly, monthly, yearly practices of regular prayer, practicing the presence of God, cultivating gratitude. Before you really need those things, it's better to develop that depth sooner. So it's never too late to start, but the sooner we start, the better. And the sooner we start our children and young Christians on these practices as well, the better. So that they too will be able to say with the psalmist, I take refuge in you. Thanks for joining us today. And I hope that you'll be able to join us next time, where we talk about some more simple practices